All right, here we are back from spring break and ready to shift our view of the Normans from the northern world to the Mediterranean world. We spent the first half of the class on the Normans in Normandy and England and in the surrounding areas. And that was a fairly simple situation, actually. The Normans in Normandy, they were associated with people in Brittany and in Flanders, but then when they conquered England, it was a pretty straightforward situation. Now we're going to move. We'll go back in time to an earlier time period when the Normans started leaving Normandy and going to the Mediterranean and settling in Italy and eventually Sicily. This is a much more complicated situation. What I hope to do tonight is to look at the political situation in Italy and the surrounding areas at the time when the Normans started to come there, and look a little bit at the lay of the land and what Italy is like and what it looks like and what are the conditions that the Normans encountered as they came there. And then I want to look at the process by which the Normans pretty much took over southern Italy, and we probably won't get to Sicily today, but we'll look at Sicily next week and at what we're going to find. I'll remind you that your main textbook for this period, you actually have two, The Age of Robert Guiscard, which is by Graham Loud, and he is one of the few English-speaking historians who has worked extensively on southern Italy, and so we're just very lucky that so many people are writing books now about southern Italy, because 10 years ago you couldn't get a thing. Well, there were some old books by David Douglas, but they were David Douglas was a specialist in England, and he wasn't a specialist in southern Italy and Sicily, and most of that research he had done was based on older works done largely by French scholars. Graham Loud has worked extensively in Italy himself, and he's really the leading English scholar on Italy. There are some others that I'll bring in, some books from other authors who are working on southern Italy and Sicily as well. So we'll use The Age of Robert Guiscard, especially this week and next week. Continue to look at the Normans in Europe, our collection of primary sources by Elizabeth Van Hoots, which is an absolutely marvelous book to give you the primary sources on which all the interpretations are based. And she really has done a wonderful job. This is a great collection on Italy and Sicily as well as England. And then when we get into the later period, when we look at the Kingdom of Sicily, we'll have our book by Hubert Holbein, Roger II of Sicily. And so we'll look at that a couple of weeks from now. Okay. That. Now, let's take a look at the situation. Before the conquest, before the Norman conquest, there was a very complex situation in Italy. There are many different areas, and I don't think we might have to, having a little bit of trouble with this. Okay. All right. Well, we'll try that. Okay, there's a very complex situation. There are various areas of Italy, and they're all very different. Italy is still that way. The way that Italy has always been, even during the Roman Empire, was that it's a collection of various little pockets of culture in areas from one end to the other. And this is true today as well as in the Roman Empire and in the Norman times. People even spoke different languages in very close areas. There were little pocket environments, you might call them, in which people would speak a local language. It could be based on Latin, it could be based on Greek. Oh, thanks.
Okay, now you can change
the oh, good. Okay, so maybe I can move that up there. Yeah. The zoom. All right. Oh, good. Perfect. All right. We solved the problem. There, that's better. All right, they're little pocket environments, and they're pocket environments because Italy is so mountainous and so rocky and hilly that people get isolated in little sections of Europe, and this is of Italy, of the peninsula. And so this exists today in the languages they speak. That some are based on Greek, and some are based on Latin, and some are linguistically not connected to anything at all. But they speak all these little very local dialects, and so there's no international Italian language that everybody speaks, it's kind of a difficult place to get around. Politically, it's very diverse and very disconnected as well. In the north of Italy is the area of Tuscany, which is very closely connected to the German Empire. And the German Empire, of course, is directly north of Italy. And the imperial forces always claimed Italy as part of their domain. The German emperor thought of himself as the heir of Charlemagne, and that part of his domain should be most of Italy as well. Tuscany tended to shift sides. Sometimes the Tuscans would go along with the imperial rule of the Germans, and other times they would side with the church, and they would be levied against the German emperors. There was a great power shift at about the time the Normans were going into that area. Beatrice of Tuscany, who was the widow of the Count of Tuscany, then married Godfrey the Bearded, who was Count of Upper Lorraine. And Upper Lorraine was also a fragmented area. It had been for a while part of the German Empire, but partly separated, and the Counts of Lorraine tended to work against the emperors and assert their own authority and their own rule. And so you have a lot of political disunity going on, and with the marriage of Beatrice of Tuscany, Beatrice of Bar is her real name, and Godfrey the Bearded, there was an alliance between these very powerful enemies of the German emperor. Lorraine itself got broken up into two parts, and because the emperors were afraid of the power of the Counts of Lorraine, and it was divided between two brothers. One got Upper Lorraine and one got Lower Lorraine, and the emperors by and large tried to keep the Counts of Lorraine from ever unifying those two sections because it's a very large area. There's also a lot of interplay between imperial politics and the papacy, and the daughter of Beatrice of Tuscany was Matilda of Tuscany, and we have this very strange marriage that took place between Beatrice's daughter Matilda and Godfrey's daughter, Godfrey the Hunchback. Now, in modern times, this would be counted as incest by the Catholic Church. In those days, there was nobody to object to that marriage. But like this marriage up here, which meant that two powerful enemies of the empire were unified, the same thing happened down here, but now these powerful enemies of the empire were also allies of the Roman Catholic Church, the Reformed papacy that was just arising at this time. And so all of this politics between the empire and the papacy would have an enormous impact on the Normans. They wouldn't remain separated. There's even a connection between Tuscany and Lorraine and the Normans in Normandy, and this comes through Matilda of Tuscany's stepsister. This is Ida of Lorraine, who was the daughter of Godfrey the Bearded and the sister of Godfrey the Hunchback. By the way, this genealogy is on your website, so you can look that up. She married Eustace of Boulogne, and do you all remember who Eustace of Boulogne was from the first part of the class? That was, of course, the Count of Boulogne, who had first been married before Ida. He was married to Goda, the sister of Edward the Confessor, and so he then had a lot of English land, and he felt he had a claim to the Kingdom of England as well. So here we have another connection with the Normans going on. Well, the empire regarded all Italy as under their control, and this included the Counts of Tuscany, but the Counts of Tuscany traditionally sided with the Reformed papacy, who fought against imperial control. So that we have that situation going on in the north. And let's kind of get our bearings with some of these maps here. Here is Italy. Tuscany is right here. This is the area of Tuscany, and maybe we'll just zoom in on that. Okay. Yes, that's a little better. Okay, this is Tuscany right here, which is a buffer zone north of the Papal States. The Papal States are right in here south of Tuscany, and then immediately south of that is the area that the Normans get into and they take control of. Now, Lorraine is right up here. I'm not sure how well it shows on this map, but Lorraine is up here, and it is, maybe it's more like here, and it is right next to Boulogne and Flanders. Upper Lorraine is down here, and Lower Lorraine is here, lower being closer to the sea, and Upper Lorraine being the mountainous area. And so the alliance here is between these two major areas, which then immediately challenges the power of the German emperor. Okay, now in the north of Italy, here is Tuscany here. In the north of Italy, in this area, are what are called the northern Lombard city-states. And Pavia was a center of law and education. It had been the, Okay. Pavia was a center of law and education, and it had been a center of the capital city, in fact, of the Lombard kingdom that had been in northern Italy. And there were very early law texts that were written at that time. And one of the most important law texts was written by Burchard of Worms. I forgot to write that down for you, and let me see if I can do that. And this is one of the most important law texts that had been collected at that time. And this is far earlier than Gratian's decretals and the codification of medieval law and medieval church law. This is investigation of the law and the use of law and the collection of a series of laws that is much earlier than anything else that's going on anywhere else in Europe, except possibly England. And so Pavia was that center. Do you remember when we've mentioned Pavia before? We've mentioned Pavia at an earlier time. Yes?
It was one of the places that, what's his name, kept going to when he would leave England in the Archbishopric of Canterbury, and he'd come down to see the Pope, but he'd stay at Pavia.
Oh, no, he wouldn't stay at Pavia, but Lanfranc was from Pavia. Remember that Lanfranc had been trained as a lawyer in Pavia, and he had left Pavia and had gone to Normandy. And one of the major things he did was concern himself with law and the collection of English law, and especially church law. And so that's because he had that background in Pavia. Well, this movement in Pavia in the northern Lombard states would impact southern Italy as well, and would have that same kind of an impact on it. There's something else that's going on in northern Italy among the Lombard city-states, and that is the foundation of a lot of church reform monasteries. In particular, Vallombrosa is a very important one, but when we looked at the rise of reform in Normandy, when the churches were being reformed, remember that Lanfranc would frequently draw on monks that had come from northern Italy, from these centers of church reform, monastic reform. They ended up in Normandy, and they also became members of the church elite, the bishoprics and the monasteries of Normandy as well, so that he had probably known them in northern Italy at that point. Now, moving south of Tuscany, we have the Papal States. And it was in the Papal States that we see the rise of the Reformed papacy, but the rise of the Reformed papacy was more or less triggered by these reform movements in the north of Italy. And there was more and more of a movement to break the church free of the control of any layman whatsoever. And up until this time, the church had really worked hand in glove with the imperial forces in the same way that they had worked with Charlemagne. Charlemagne was the model of the church, and Charlemagne pretty much controlled the popes and told them what to do. And the Ottonian emperors of Germany and their successors also had that same attitude, that it was their prerogative to appoint the popes. And so this was the situation that the papacy was in at this time. In fact, the early reformers of the church, including Leo IX, who became pope in 1049, these early reformers worked hand in glove with the emperors, particularly the emperors Henry II and Henry III. And so the imperial reformers were part of the Ottonian legacy, but they also regarded Italy as under their control and the Pope as under their control. And so here we can see some of these areas on this closer map where we can see the area of Pavia, which is right here. This is the city of Pavia in the north. We don't have, Tuscany is right here in this area. The Papal States are right here in Rome, and now we're moving into the area that the Normans would eventually conquer, the area of southern Italy that we're going to deal with in this part of the class. Okay, in the south of Italy, in this area, we have a very mixed up situation. There are, in essence, three powers, or actually four powers, all vying for supremacy. And let's run through them, and then we'll look at this map again, and I'll locate all of them for you as we go through. In the south of Italy, there are southern Lombard city-states, and they had developed a culture quite different from the culture of the northern Lombard states. They weren't as legally minded, they weren't as progressive, they weren't as governmentally developed. They were far more, I guess you would call them, backward and independent, and more concerned with their own power. Okay, they even had a different name. The Lombards in the south were called Langobards, as opposed to Lombards in the north. And the Lombard city-states were centered around these areas directly south of Rome, which would be Benevento, Capua, and Salerno. And I'll locate those on the map for you. Let's see, I do have that map. Okay, I've written them in on this map here, and I'm not sure we can see them. Okay. Yes, is there a question?
You're supposed to dial out to this class.
I'm sorry, I didn't understand what you said.
Whatever studio he's in.
Did you understand that?
They have a live mic with you, just hooked up, and they have a live mic, and I don't think they know it.
Okay, some of you on the other sites, on the off...
Please use it. Don't call in some of them, because they'll never know who you're talking about.
Okay, you have a live mic there, and you're talking, and we can hear you, and you're not talking to us, okay? You're talking to each other, and your mic is live. Okay? Thanks. All right, now let me zoom in on this. Okay, here is the area we're talking about. What was I talking about? The Lombard city-states, Benevento, Capua, and Salerno. They're right here. Here is Salerno down here. Here is Capua, and here is Aversa, and Benevento is slightly to the north here. But these are the areas of the Lombard city-states right here. Kind of inland in the area that is now called Campania. And so that's where they're located. All right, the next area that we're going to talk about, the independent powers that are here, are independent city-states Like, pardon? Oh, thank you. All right. The next group that we need to talk about, I'll be zooming back and forth, I think, are independent city-states like Amalfi, Naples, and Gaeta. And these off and on are the Langobards try to control them and bring them under their control, but they're continuously rebelling and trying to remain independent of any other power that controls them. So Amalfi, Naples, and Gaeta. And these are largely coastal towns, and the reason they have strength to be independent is because they have huge trading enterprises, a lot of times with the Muslims. And so they're able to maintain their independence. Here is Gaeta up here, here is Amalfi down here, and Naples is over here. They're all along the coast, and they're all based on trading and merchant enterprise there. All right. Our third group are the Byzantine enclaves, like Bari, which is actually the capital, and the Byzantine areas of southern Italy, which not completely but partially include the areas of Apulia, Calabria, and Basilicate, which owed allegiance to the Byzantines. And these areas, the Byzantines tried to control them. And by the way, in case you aren't sure of this, or if you've run into this in your reading, the Byzantines are often called the Greeks. And these two are synonymous terms. They're called the Greeks because they speak Greek at this time. And so when I say the Greeks, I mean the Byzantines. And when I say the Byzantines, I mean the Greeks. They're the same people. They're the Byzantine, the Roman Empire that's left over. Okay, so these provinces, Apulia, Calabria, and Basilicate, are nominally under control of the Byzantines, but in reality, they're almost completely independent, and they're constantly rebelling, and they're constantly fighting each other, and they're joining with other forces and rebelling against the Greeks. So they're not really under Greek control. Okay, and those areas are here. This is Calabria, this is Basilicate, and this is Apulia. Nominally Greek, but in reality breaking free in very large measure on their own. The fourth great power in this area, all vying for control of southern Italy, is the Emirate of Sicily. And joined with the Muslims of Sicily are Tunisian interests from the coast of Africa. And so in about the 900s, really the early 900s, the late 800s, Sicily had been conquered by the Muslims, and it was now completely under the control of the Muslims. And in Tunisia, from this area over here, there were often expeditions of pirates attacking along the Amalfi coast here, attacking Bari, attacking along the coast here. And they came from Sicily, and they also came from Tunisia, different groups. And so this is the fourth great power in this area, so that you can see that the Normans are coming into a very much more difficult and less clearly defined situation than they ever had in England. It's a much harder thing for them to live with. Complicating this is the geography and the environment of Italy. And I brought you as many pictures as I could. One of the interesting things I did was to drive this car in Italy. And so when I was driving, I didn't take as many pictures as I wanted to, but the drive was an adventure. This is the area near Capua and Aversa from those northern Lombard city-states. And this is fairly much flat and level plains and farmland. I took this picture from up on the top of a hill looking out over the whole countryside. And the countryside it's flat and it's able to be farmed, although citrus fruit and olives and grapes are the cash crops of this area, as they probably were in Norman times as well. It's an economy left over from the Roman Empire. And so that's what would have been here. This is a lemon grove, and this is farmland, and here's a little town going off into the distance. So this would be the area of Campania, near Capua and Aversa. This is the area of the Amalfi Coast where the independent city-states are located, Gaeta and Amalfi and Naples, and this is what the coastline looks like. This is right in the middle of that Amalfi Coast. It's Ravenna, and it's up on a very high hill. And at this point, I have to say something about the geography of Italy. If you can see this picture, you can see that there are very high mountains going down and sheerly dropping into the sea. It's like that all along that Amalfi Coast, all the way down the coast of Italy to Sicily. Sheer mountains rising almost vertically up into the sky, dropping precipitously into the sea on the one side and precipitously in the land in the center, except that the whole center is mountainous. I mean, there just aren't very many places south of Campania where you can do actual farming. One thing that really struck me during this trip was looking at these sheer mountains that almost rise vertically up. Is no wonder the Romans were such marvelous engineers and bridge builders. That was the only way they could tie their empire together. And of course, these Roman bridges still exist. They're still there. Yeah.
So would the main products of this region be things like grapes and olives, and which could grow in such terrain? Or?
Yes, mountainous terrain, and the mountains were all terraced. And one of the really amazing things I saw on the Amalfi Coast is they would terrace these mountains and in steep steps down, and they grew lemon groves all along, and lemons are the big products of that area. They had lemon groves going down the mountains, and they were covered with cloth, not to necessarily keep the birds away or to keep the wind from blowing it, but to keep the hail from beating the trees down when they had severe weather storms of that kind. And so it's kind of an unforgiving land. Pardon?
How would it grow if it's covered with cloth? Wouldn't that block out the light?
Well, it's the same kind of cloth that we use in a greenhouse that would not block out the light or the air, but would protect it from the elements. Yeah.
I have to take issue with your statement about the situation, the political situation made the Normans' task more difficult. I would think it would be the other way around. When you have all these competing factions which don't get along, which don't cooperate, which distrust each other, each one vying for support, vying for control, each one ready to backstab and undermine the other, I would think that would actually make the job of the Normans a great deal easier.
And I think I might agree with you. Anybody else have an opinion on that? I mean, I think you're right about that this is a situation, a political situation, very ripe for forces playing off one against the other, and switching sides, and which is exactly what happens. They switch sides and they play one off against the other. It's more difficult than England in the sense that you don't have a one unified sweep of conquest. It has to be an infiltration where you can play one off against the other. It's an opportunity for small groups to really realize their ambitions here in southern Italy that that could never have happened in England. The situation is very different from England. Yeah.
So in a divided situation, it just takes longer because you have to take things one after another, the different principalities.
Yes, you have to take one city individually after another. It's not like England where you can go in and pretty much conquer the whole country in a couple of years, because England was so unified. It was naturally unified, and you could keep its unification functioning. And this was not true of southern Italy. Well, we've got this part of the area which is near Amalfi along the coast where the independent city-states are. Now this is moving down. Excuse me, I caught something on the airline. This is moving down into Basilicate and moving down the coast toward Apulia and Calabria. Okay, moving down the coast, the mountains are almost vertical. There's very little farmland. They're aren't areas where you can grow farmland. As we said, the crops are citrus fruits, also plums and peaches and groves of fruit groves of that kind, but lots of wine and lots of olive oil. And these are the products. Okay, here you can see a little bit more of the lay of that land. This was in about the middle of that area around Cosenza, moving toward the south into Calabria. And I took this through the bushes, but I wanted you to be able to see that there's a dip into this valley, and then the mountains rise sheerly, almost vertically, to these outcroppings, and it's spring, so everything's green, but in the summer it wouldn't be. And here you can see the mountains that run down the middle of Italy right in the background. They're snow-covered, and they're very high. And so this is forbidding terrain. And if you imagine those Normans riding their horses into this area, it was very dangerous. I mean, they were extremely brave to go into here, into this very forbidding terrain with warrior factions all around them all the time. Yeah.
For grain, though, they would have to import it?
They did grow some grain. They grew some grain, but there aren't just fields and fields of grain. The grain is harder to grow in this kind of a terrain. The grain is in the northern part of Campania, where remember those Lombard city-states were. Campania, that would have been Benevento and Capua, and that area grows grain. Okay. But this is in the south. The south is really unproductive. Here's some more of that land. This is in Basilicate, and you can see the lay of that land and the sharply rising mountains. And the little towns are all clustered together. People don't live out there in the countryside. You can't grow anything. And so the little towns are all clustered together. This is Sicily, and this is as seen from the mainland of Italy. You can just look right across. And this is at the shortest passage across to Sicily. You can see it there. And so to the Normans, it would have immediately been tempting. They could just jump on their ships and go right across there and take Sicily, and they would see it as a great gem, because Sicily was, especially the port of Palermo, was a major trading post, and Sicily was the granary of the Roman Empire, and there were great fields in Sicily where you could grow a lot of grain and a lot of fruit. Sicily was a very rich agricultural area, much richer than the part of southern Italy that the Normans eventually took over. So without Sicily, one has to wonder if they could have formed a viable state without that area of Sicily. And here's another picture of Sicily as seen from the mainland. Actually, I had just gotten on the ferry. You can see I'm looking out on the ferry, but it hadn't left yet, so you can see it from the mainland. Also, the area is very much permeated with Roman artifacts and Roman culture, and also permeated with early Christian culture. And to kind of illustrate the early Christian elements that are here, I brought these two pictures of sarcophagi, which are tombs. They're early Christian tombs, and they've been recycled and reused by the Normans to bury their dead. And so if we can zoom into this, you can see how really classical this art is. It's quite beautiful, and it's quite classical. And so this classical art surrounded the Normans as they came into this area, and of course surrounded the people who were already there. And here is another sarcophagus. This has an interesting inscription on it. Let me see if I can get a little closer. The inscription actually says, is added in medieval time. There's kind of a wild orgy going on in the background there. I don't know if you can see that. And the inscription says that this tomb is for the sons of the six male heirs of the Grassi family. Okay, but it's medieval. It's medieval. It's not Roman, but we have this orgiastic kind of thing. going on in this tomb. I'll be showing you some more of these as we go along. Okay, so now we've got an idea of the kind of political situation that surrounded the Normans as they came into this area. What did they encounter as they went there? What did they have to deal with? Now we'll talk a little bit about sources, the sources that we can use to find out what happened in southern Italy. And I'm making use of this one particular book quite a great deal because I really like it. It's quite an interesting book. It's Making History. Okay. Making History, the Normans and Their Historians in 11th Century History by 11th Century Italy by Kenneth Baxter Wolfe. And this is a very fine book. I really like it. It's not a history of the Normans in Italy, but it's a history of the historians who wrote about the Normans in Italy. And he has quite an interesting take on them. I really liked it. I'm going to follow a lot of his arguments as I go through here. But here are the sources. And like in England, remember in England you have this explosion of historical writing. You have an explosion of historical writing in Italy as well. And the major historians who wrote about the great deeds of the Normans who came into that area were Geoffrey Malaterra, William of Apulia, and where's the other one? Amatus of Monte Cassino. These are the big three who write things that make you think of William of Poitiers writing about the Gesta Norman Ducums, William of Jumièges writing the history of the Normans. These are the same kinds of historians who are writing with a lot of bias and writing to tell a particular story of conquest. Now, these historians can be cross-checked just as we cross-check William of Jumièges and Orderic Vitalis and William of Poitiers, and we cross-check them with year-by-year accounts. In England, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, for example, here we have annals written in churches in Benevento, in Bari, in Monte Cassino, La Cava, so that the yearly events can be cross-checked and dated more carefully, and even the biases of the authors can be cross-checked, because they often will give opinions as to why things happen or why people do the certain things they do, and so that you can cross-check them. This is quite an interesting one. The Alexiad of Anna Komnena, she is actually writing in the Byzantine Empire, and when the Normans actually invade and try to conquer the Byzantine Empire, she tells that story. So that's a really interesting one. Another person who can be cross-checked who is not so close is Leo of Ostia, who is farther away. He's closer to Rome, and he gives a more biased point of view from the Roman point of view. And Orderic Vitalis, of course, is writing from Normandy, and he knows what's going on all over the Norman world, and so he tells you what's going on in Italy and Sicily as well. So these are the sources. There are more than this, but these are the major ones. Going to the analysis again of Kenneth Baxter Wolfe, he raises the question, do we merely want to create a narrative of what happened? How do we want to tell the story of the Norman conquest? Do we want to just make a list of all the things that happened in a very scientific way? Do we want to treat all these sources as reservoirs of factual information and sort of weed out all the opinion and only pull the facts out? That's one way of writing history, and the person who has done this for this period and this time and place is H.E.J. Cowdery, who wrote The Age of Abbot Desiderius, excuse me, Monte Cassino, the Papacy, and the Normans in the 11th and early 12th centuries. And this is a marvelous book, and he tries to track down all of the different elements that put together the events in a very scientific way to tell what actually happened. And so that's the technique that is being used to write H.E.J. Cowdery's book. There are other ways of writing history, though. Do we want to consider the context in which the history is described? Do we want to discuss how the participants in all of these great events are seeing it? How do they see what is happening in their own time? How are they interpreting the events around them? The first person in England to really take any kind of step in that direction at all was R.H.C. Davis, who wrote The Normans and Their Myth. And one of the really strange things about historical writing among the Normans in England is English historians have treated them as if they literally have no biases. I mean, treating them as if you can somehow mine them for the truth, but you don't have to pay attention to, you don't have to take into account the fact that they're shaping that story to write a certain kind of propaganda. And we talked a lot about propaganda in the Norman and the English sources. But there's still a huge tendency among English historians to accept at face value a lot of these stories. One example I can bring to you is William Rufus, the idea that he was so maligned by the church historians, and the English are still reluctant to even think that William Rufus could be any different than he is described in these very biased sources. Well, the only person who has really questioned anything about this propagandistic way of writing history is R.H.C. Davis. And he wrote this book, The Normans and Their Myth. It's a wonderful book, unfortunately too short. I mean, he needed to say more, but maybe somebody will pick up that theme and go beyond Davis. And Davis raised the question, were the Norman conquerors of England, Italy, and Antioch, quote, a separate and distinct people? What he meant was there a race of Normans who burst out in the world and conquered everything around them in the North Sea and in the Mediterranean and in the Crusades? And were these a race of people destined to control the world as their historians, their own historians, portray them? Is this true, or is this a myth the Normans themselves created? And what R.H.C. Davis argued was, yes, it was a myth. That this pan-Norman identity was a fiction that the Normans themselves created about the greatness of the Norman people, seeing themselves connected to themselves in England and connected to the people in Italy and on crusade. But he established that point. He said, yes, they have created that, but he stopped, and he didn't go beyond that. Well, where does this pan-Norman identity come from? Where is this myth coming from? It's coming from authors such as Orderic Vitalis, who writes about the greatness of the Norman peoples, and William of Jumièges, he's doing the same thing. Also by modern historians such as Charles Homer Haskins, Evelyn Jameson, and David Douglas. They also take that kind of a view as that there's this great Norman race that takes over the world. Well, in order to try to answer that question and go beyond what Davis did, Kenneth Baxter Wolfe takes up the question of what are the interpretive structures of the authors? How are these authors shaping the history into an interpretive story that explains what happened in their world when the Normans moved into it? And this is his book, Making History, The Normans and Their Historians in 11th Century Italy. Yeah, question?
Well, you know, it's like Dizzy Dean said, it ain't bragging if you do it. And the Normans may have exaggerated, but the fact of the matter is they did have an incredible record of conquest back there during the 11th century.
You're right. They did. Did you have a comment on that?
But I'm thinking that the fact that they, whether or not they are one people, is something that seems to come from Dudo, where he uses literary devices to create this very romantic kind of story, and it seems to be picked up by everybody else within those times also.
I think you're right. Dudo was the first one to do it, to write that propaganda about the Norman dukes, and they are picked up by further authors who then talk about the greatness of the Norman people. But the thing is, the thing that is so strange is these three historians in Italy, Geoffrey Malaterra, William of Apulia, and Amatus and I can't remember where he's from. Monte Cassino, right, thank you. They are writing completely independently from Dudo or any of the other Norman historians. They're not Normans by birth, they're Italians, and they're doing the same thing, but they're not Normans. Okay, so why is that happening? Yeah, don't forget your mic.
The Normans may not have started out as a cohesive people the way that, Dudo makes them sound like. Yeah. However, by this point, you take enough of a mismatch of something and interbreed it, you're going to get something else. And I think by this point that there is a Norman people. They didn't start out as a Norman people, but I think by the time they start making all these conquests, they are a unified Norman people that is distinguishable from other cultures in Europe. And that, yes, they are making this, and that's why these Italians are writing about them this way, because they are now seen as that. So it may have started out as propaganda in the beginning, but it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you write that it is something and you act as if it's true, it can become true. And they made it true.
That's a really interesting point. Did you have a comment on that too?
I'm thinking that the fact also that they became sort of a backbone sometimes to the papacy's rise may also make them very popular and to have some sort of a destiny kind of.
They felt like they had a destiny, but isn't that hindsight though? I mean,
I'm wondering if some people who write at this time are historian enough and they think and write synthetic histories already, like Odric Vitalis, so they would have picked up on that.
Yeah, and I think they would have. But this is kind of where Kenneth Baxter Wolfe is coming from. He's saying, why is it that we have the same kind of mythology picked up in Italy and expressed in the same way when these historians would not have had that Norman background? They wouldn't have read Dudo, they wouldn't have read William of Jumièges, but they're telling a story of a Norman conquest in Italy and Sicily, and they turn people like Robert Guiscard and Richard of Aversa into fully as great heroes as William the Conqueror. And so what is the mechanism that's going on here? And so let me describe a little more about this to you. And I'm not going to really come to a conclusion, although you're welcome to read Kenneth Baxter Wolfe's book. But I think we have the makings of a final exam question here from our discussion. Okay, what Wolfe says is that Malaterra, William of Apulia, and Amatus of Monte Cassino transformed the Norman invaders of southern Italy and Sicily into the rightful heirs of the Greeks and the Lombards. That somehow they rightfully came in and took what they were destined to have. And what they're explaining is a historiographical conquest. Okay, they're explaining how these Normans came in and conquered, and they're giving them some kind of a justification for this conquest that makes it rightful and legal. And when you go ahead and read the sources and try to just mine out the actual facts that happened, you can see that there's no justification of what the Normans are doing at all. It was might makes right. They're coming in and they're grabbing whatever they can get and holding on to it. And they're allying with their friends and each other to literally, in a brute force conquest of this whole area. And so what Baxter Wolfe is saying is, here we have a case of these barbarians coming in and actually conquering a quite civilized land of the Lombards and the Byzantines. And somehow the historians have to justify this barbarian conquest of a civilized land and make the barbarians justified, to make them, the rightful conquerors. Yeah.
Well, considering the fact that there had been previous conquest of that same land by the Lombards and the East Romans, and before them, as well as the Arabs in Sicily, and before them the Romans, and before them the Greeks, and before them the Etruscans, why in the wide world would they suddenly feel compelled to justify anything at all?
Well, does anybody have an answer for that? I mean, why do you think these local writers would have to justify what the Normans were doing?
I think, once again, fighting against the Arabs is a good thing from their point of view.
Yeah.
Just like the Franks had done before, and they had been remembered for generations.
Yeah, yeah. And the Normans took part in that, fighting against what they saw as an outside civilization, which were the Arabs, the Muslims who were there, but also the Byzantines. The Byzantines were considered outside invaders of Italy, and so there are these little jewels, little gems or seeds of heroic activities that people could admire. Yeah.
Now, that is a difficult thing to understand. What was the standing of the Byzantines in those times in terms of the writers? Did they consider them to have any kind of sanctity or importance?
That's a very important question that you're asking. Their attitude toward the Byzantines was mixed, okay, because they, of course, were in favor of the Roman Catholic Church, and there was a rivalry between the Byzantine Church, which we call the Greek Church, and the Roman Catholic Church, and each one claimed domain over the other's territory. And so the church was very antagonistic toward the Byzantines, because in any of the areas that the Byzantines controlled, the Greek church was in charge. And this was at the very same time that the Reformed popes among the Catholic Church, the Roman Church, were trying to establish their authority all over Europe, and not just in Italy, but in the rest of the European church as well. So the Greeks were seen as an enemy of the church. Yeah.
I do remember one time one of the popes who had not accepted some of the laws from the Byzantines they were trying to arrest the pope.
Oh, okay, the Byzantines, yes. Yes, well, they regularly excommunicated each other, and so you do have that going on, too, that kind of rivalry. And then there's just sheer power, the sheer power and greed for control of everything that's going on among all these rival factions. But it's so mixed, because sometimes when the reformers in the church saw the Normans as a threat, they would appeal to the Byzantines to save them. And then when the Byzantines refused, not because they didn't want to, but because they were busy in other parts of the empire, then the Catholics would turn to the Normans. And so you see this switching sides continually between all the different factions that are going on.
It's also possible that we moderns think of power grab as something bad, but in those times the historians might see that as being quite heroic. I mean, for someone or a small number of people to take over a certain piece of land.
They might see it. Yeah, well, this is what Kenneth Baxter Wolfe is arguing, that the difficult task of these historians, these three historians, was to explain why the Byzantines and the Romans yielded to these Norman barbarians. How did these backward barbarians conquer these civilized, advanced people? And how could you make them heroes of such a conquest? And this is what he is arguing that the three Norman historians did. He's arguing that they transformed raw military power into legitimate political authority, and that each of these authors make history and bestow it on a people that did not have one before. And so the other thing he's arguing is that the Normans had no history. They're just stragglers who are straggling in there. They found their unity by making alliances with each other. They felt a kinship. They allied with each other, and just through brute force, they took over the whole area. And so this is what he's arguing. And it's a really interesting kind of theory. I think I can't go along with it totally, but it does help explain some of the things that are going on. So I think that it's kind of an interesting kind of theory. He also brings up the fact that there's a parallel process that has been shown before, largely through the work of Walter Goffert. This is just an exquisite book that Walter Goffert wrote. It's Narrators of Barbarian History, and he wrote this book to explain why four of the historians who have normally been called nationalistic historians actually wrote their histories. And the four historians are Jordanus, Gregory of Tours, Paul the Deacon, and Bede. And Jordanus created a history for the Goths in the Roman Empire out of virtually nothing. The Goths were a people who had no history, who felt that they needed a history because in order to be like the Romans, they had to have a history where they came from some kind of a heroic past. And Jordanus actually created that history. And what he was arguing, he was a Goth himself, and he was arguing that the Goths and the Roman were equally strong and heroic people, and he was arguing in the end that they should intermarry and join together into one strong people, and that's the theme running through Jordanus's history. He argues the same kind of thing in Gregory of Tours, who writes about the Franks. Gregory of Tours writes the history of the Franks, and what he's doing is explaining how the Franks become civilized, and they become civilized through being Christianized. And formerly, all these histories were thought of as nationalistic, proclaiming the greatness of a particular people. But in fact, what it is kind of justifying their existence, creating a new history for them. The same is true with Paul the Deacon, who wrote the history of the Lombard, and perhaps the most controversial was Bede, who wrote the history of the English Church and people. That has been always thought of as nationalistic. But what he's talking about is the conversion of the English, the civilizing of the English into being Christianized. So at the time that all these people were writing, history as a genre had become more popular among the Latin writers, and history was just really exploding as something that was written at this time that people were interested in reading. Certainly this is true in England and Normandy, partially true in France, but it's happening in the Norman areas, and I think Kenneth Baxter Wolfe wasn't aware of how centralized history was to the Norman peoples wherever they were. On the other hand, you also have to look at the First Crusade, which also generated an explosion of historical writing. So historical writing is really taking off as a way to explain what is happening. And as R.H.C. Davis commented, the Normans never seem to have tired of writing about their own achievements. So the Normans were not modest about what they did. So Italy produced these histories the most quickly among all the other Norman groups. And this is pretty interesting. I hadn't realized that before, but when he was figuring that out, within the century of the 11th century, when the Normans first appeared, all these histories were written by the end of the century, and this is actually much faster than all those English histories were written and the French histories. So the Italians wrote theirs a lot quicker. Yeah.
I'm wondering if the Old Testament provides some kind of a model for, those people who are very much nobodies take over a land and become a people or a nation.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I suspect yes, because when you go through these histories and you see they'll strike up parallels. One of them was written about by Pope Gregory the Great when he talked about the conversion of England, and it appears in Bede. And he talks about the Israelites progressing step by step closer to God, and he sees the what you might call the conquest of England by Christianity as that very same process. And so they're continually finding biblical models that they can use. That one pops into my mind immediately. I'm sure there are more. And so another one that comes to my mind that they would have used, that they did use, was Goscelin of Saint Bertin wrote about the conversion of England, and he actually dedicated this particular work to Lanfranc. He was writing a story about one of the older Anglo-Saxon female saints, and he talked about Lanfranc coming to England and building a new Jerusalem. And he made it an absolute parallel with the building of the city of Jerusalem that Lanfranc was doing in building a new church in the land of England. So this certainly is going on. I don't know if this is going on in these because I don't have copies of the original Latin here, but that would be interesting to look up. Okay. Norman explorers to Spain and Italy. You know, we're almost out of time. I think this would be a good point to take our break, unless anybody has any particular questions they'd like to ask before we get into the actual mechanics of the conquest of Italy. Any questions about the lay of the land or the conditions? Yeah, don't forget to press your mic. You don't have a mic, okay. Uh-huh.
What was it called again?
Burchard of Worms. And did you have a question about that?
No, I didn't get the name.
Oh, you just didn't get the name of it, okay.
We have open tables with mics when we come back from break.
Pardon?
We have plenty of tables with mics when we come back from break.
Okay, okay. Good, all right.
It would make better TV
All right. Excuse me. Any more questions, comments? Anybody want to enter the debate on the writing of history in Italian, Norman Italian times? Okay. You can be thinking of questions over the break. Any questions off campus, at our off-campus sites? No, just static.
Not so far.
Not so far. Okay. Let's take about a 15-minute break, and when we come back, we'll look at Norman explorers to Spain and Italy and the Norman infiltration of Italy.